This is AI Goes to College, a new podcast about artificial intelligence in higher education and beyond.
Welcome back to AI Goes to College, the podcast that explores the intersection between artificial intelligence and higher education. I'm your host, Professor Sarah, and today we have an award-winning educator, Laura Dumin, joining us to talk about accessibility and equity in higher education. So welcome, Laura. Thank you for being here.
Good to be here.
Thank you for talking to us about AI.
Certainly. I'm excited.
I know it's so busy for you. It's a busy time over here as well. So I want to give you a little bit of introduction. Okay. So I understand that you are not only an award-winning professor at the University of Central Oklahoma, but you're also the AI coordinator at your institution as well, right?
Yes, I am.
And you also run the Facebook page that I love, the Higher Ed, let me get this right, Higher Ed Discussions of AI Writing and Use.
Yes.
So that others can join, because this has been so helpful in my planning for this semester.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. It's always good to hear that something's working the way you want it to.
And I also see that you have a certification in Neuroeducation and Embodied Learning Institute, or with the Neuroeducation and Embodied Learning Institute. So I'd love to hear more about that in our discussion. And it looks like you've recently published on AI in education. And I know you've been speaking about this since the early days, way back in, what was it, January of 2023. Because I heard you on the Everyday AI podcast. And it's just a wonderful job that you've done with building this community on Facebook. I think this is great. Every day I see new ideas rolling in.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun to watch the community grow and to see the different ideas that people have, because we all have different populations of students, and it can be really hard sometimes to see beyond our own population of students or beyond our own problems that we're having or concerns that we see popping up. So it's great to get to hear from other people as well as to how they're using AI.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to put that link in our show notes if you don't mind.
Oh, certainly.
For other professors who would like to join and get some ideas. But I think it's ideas for all educators, not just, higher ed. Okay, so before we get to the serious stuff, I want to talk about fiction, since we're both English professors. So one of my favorite movies of all time is Her. Like, long before I became interested in AI, I love that movie. And I'm also a big fan of the novel Clara and the Sun, which I've recently read. I don't know if you are familiar with. It's Kazuo Ishiguro. But they're both stories about these extremely empathetic bots, these companion robots and AIs. I think in Clara and the Sun, they call it an AF. So she's an artificial friend. I just wonder if there are any fictional AIs that you find particularly inspiring or frightening, one way or the other.
I have always loved the entity Jane, Ender's Game. And she's a little bit different in that they're never sure if she's sentient or not. They think that she is, but she talks to Ender all the time. She's in a little bud in his ear, and she can hear everything that is happening in the room, and she responds to him in, real time, just fast communication. And she has all the answers and all the information. And I've always thought that would be kind of cool, but also maybe a little bit frightening.
Yeah, very cool.
And I think it would be good for situations maybe where we're struggling to know what to say, or it's maybe a heated conversation and we need ways to calm it down. That would be a really helpful AI to have, I think, for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think it's so interesting to think about, some of those stories about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to empathize? The novel that I mentioned is from the narrator is the AI. So of course you're going to identify with her. And it's just an interesting, beyond, the scary ideas about what AIs could do and if they could take over, if they became sentient, then what is that? What's our responsibility to them?
Right.
Okay, so you and I met at a conference not long ago where I know that I learned a ton of stuff in, a short time, as you do in a really good conference. But so now I'm, following a lot of different websites and social media, and I want to read all these things. And there's a lot of things in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And we were just saying before we hit record, that there's too much, and we're kind of saving all of these things. But I want to know, how do you keep up with all of the changes in AI and education these days? Who are you reading, following?
Yeah, I think number one, none of us are keeping up. And I think that's an important thing to say.
Great point. Yes.
Yes, I think we are all following a few people or following a few different programs and tools that work for us, and just sort of seeing the rest of it go by because there's too much to keep up with anymore. Yeah. I remember in January of 23, I could spend an hour or two every day and read everything that had come out, and it was great. And then by about March, that was no longer possible.
Yeah.
So now I've just finished, or I'm almost finished reading Unmasking AI by Joy, and I think it's Buolamwini. I'm maybe mispronouncing that, but it's a really great book about facial recognition bias and about how darker skinned individuals are often not picked up by facial recognition software, and what that means for people and what that means for the coders. So it's looking at both sides. Can we code our way out of this, and how would we code our way out of this? And then what happens when people are misidentified or not seen at all? I remember when iPhones first came out, where they were having problems with Asian people, and telling the camera was telling people to open their eyes, even though their eyes were open, because those cameras had been trained not on Asian faces.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And so I really love that sort of thing, looking at the bias. I have enjoyed Teaching with AI by Jose Bowen and Eddie Watson. That one's been really good. And I'm running a book group on that later this semester. So that one I really like.
Yeah.
And then I follow Jason Gulia, who I know you just recently had on the program. And I like to see what Lance Eaton is up to, and Lance Cummings. Maha Bali is really good for getting a non-Western perspective. She's just absolutely great. And then I'm also in a Google group of AI people from the Pod Network. I think that's where it started. And that's been a lot of fun too, to kind of get to see some of the developing side. So what are instructional designers looking at? What are professional development folks looking at, as well as educators? So I try and be in a couple of different spaces. And then there are also a few people that I'm following in disability studies, and there is some crossover there. Some of them are doing things in AI and some are not. So I'm trying to keep up with things that might impact my life very specifically.
It's interesting with an emerging field like this, in fields that have been developed before we were born, we know exactly who the experts are. We know where to go. So that's why I ask, because, knowing who you trust and who you follow, or people who I trust and follow and read, I want to know, well, where are they getting their information? And I'm sure things will settle at some point. But it feels, it just feels like it's just expanding, like the universe. It's just getting bigger and bigger.
I know. And it seems like every time you turn around, these tools have new updates and new features, and people are saying, oh, look at this new thing. Well, I have the paid version, so I got it first, and you don't have the paid version, so you'll get it 3 weeks down the road or whatever. And I think that can be challenging too, because we're all using different programs, and some people are paying and some people aren't.
Yeah.
And for me personally, I'm always using the free programs because that's what I think most people have access to. So that's what I like to focus on and talk about as well. I'm not using any of the paid programs either.
That's interesting. And that's a good practice, I think, as an educator, so that when you go to ask your students to use one of the programs, that what they're going to be looking at. Because what I'm familiar with, ChatGPT 4.0 paid version, is not going to be what most of them are seeing. So that's a really good point in terms of accessibility. Unmasking AI, that's one that's on my list. I definitely.
Oh, you have to get to it. Push that one to the top of your list.
Okay, good to know.
And she is such she's such a good writer and she really brings you in. It's not dry. She's a great storyteller. And so you really feel what's happening as she's talking about her experiences with this issue.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so important for an author who is covering something that could otherwise be dry, or they're basing it just on data. But yeah, that'll go on the top of my list. And I'll put that in the show notes too. And I'm going to go back and kind of research some of the other names so that we can have some links in there.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, so you have a background, it sounds like, with working in equity, right, and accessibility in higher education. So speaking of storytelling, I wanted to see if there's a personal experience that you can share with us that got you interested in accessibility or equity in education.
Sure, I will totally pull back the curtain here. I am neurodiverse and did not realize it until I was in my mid-40s, I think, like a lot of women in my age group. And I had spent my early career having a lot of trouble publishing because my voice was never right. My tone was never right. I had ideas that people liked, but they didn't like how I was presenting them. And I still have that problem. But what I have seen is that in some cases, you know, if you can afford a good editor, then you can get around that. And for a lot of us in academia, we don't have the money to afford good editors unless we've got a grant. And our students certainly don't have the money to go out and get editors and peer tutors and all of that. So I think one of the things that really brought me into the idea of equity and accessibility both were my own struggles in trying to access things. I teach a course on poverty as well. And every time I teach that course, I learn something new, as I hope my students do too, but about places where we run into those barricades that maybe other people wouldn't see. And how do we overcome those barricades, or how do we bring them down so that other people don't have to run into those barricades later? It's always been my hope that I can leave spaces easier to access than they were when I got there. And that is true with my work, with my publishing, with the Facebook group, with everything that I'm doing. I think the more students and faculty we are able to serve, the better everybody's world is. So all boats rise with a rising tide, right? And I feel very strongly about that.
Well, thank you for sharing that personal experience. I think it's always powerful when you share, you know, not only with an audience like this, but especially with your students. I know that sometimes just sharing that I have kids with my students, who a lot of my students, you know, they're, it's a commuter community. Like there's a lot of people who have jobs and many who have families, and they're like, oh, you're struggling with that kind of thing too, you know, thinking that I just live here at the college and just read books. So thank you for sharing that. I think that can definitely be true. And those invisible barricades are there. And they are invisible to those in power. That's the interesting part. You know, they don't see them. And so there doesn't seem to be a problem, you know.
Yeah, you know, for example, when my kids were younger, breastfeeding was something that was constantly on my mind. And I had students who would say, I'm on campus for 6 hours a day. There's no place for me to pump and there's no place for me to store my milk. And so they would literally have to walk around with their backpack, their pump pack, and then a rolling cooler to hold all of their milk.
Wow.
So finally, a few years back, we got lactation rooms on campus. And I think something as simple as that, like let's just put a room in every building, or a mama pod in places where we don't have space to put a new room. It doesn't have to be a lot. Or some of the other things I've done, I've worked with the digital accessibility micro-credentials. I'm starting the third and final one of the series that UCO offers, and learning how to make PowerPoints more accessible, make our Word documents more accessible, running our learning management systems through, we have Ally as the attachment to our learning management system. And so running it through that and making sure that our things are as accessible for students as possible. Not all of our students are going to know that they have a need, or maybe they're not comfortable identifying to us. Some of them can't get letters from Student Disability Services either.
Yeah.
So knowing that we have done as much as we can on the front end makes everybody's life easier.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's wonderful. Mama pods. I like that.
Yes.
Need those. Okay, so let's talk about AI.
Yeah.
How do you see, or how do you envision AI enhancing learning, like the learning experience for students who have traditionally been underserved?
Yeah. There's an interesting discussion on LinkedIn this morning about how maybe we need to step away from the idea of AI as a democratizer because these paid programs exist and they have way better tools than the free versions.
Right.
And I agree with that part. I do. But I also think that there are some spaces where maybe AI can help to democratize things. Maybe I'm still like really optimistic about that, but I'm still really optimistic about that. There was an article that I posted recently about students who could use AI to help them write their college admissions essays. And I'm actually okay with this.
Okay.
I know not everybody is, but it helps give them feedback and helps them to strengthen certain points that maybe college recruiters are looking for or admissions officers are looking for. And if we're talking about a loss of the DEI in applications for school, so we can't look at people's race and gender anymore, that means that certain students are going to get privileged and certain students won't. And students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or historically marginalized groups may then struggle to get into spaces more than they would have a year and a half ago. So I think when students can use AI to help them overcome one of those barricades, so just the getting seen by the admissions officer, they're like, oh, this person's voice is really interesting. They have a story that they've told that's really strong. I like it. Let's bring them here. So I think that's a really good space for it. I think we also have a high population of first generation students, working students, where we're not quite a commuter campus, we're a metropolitan university, but we do have a high population of commuter students. And when you have students who don't have a background in education, so none of their family went to higher ed, even a community college, they don't know to go talk to their professors to ask for help, that they can go to the tutoring center, all of these things that maybe some of us might already know about, or, my kids are going to know about these things because I'm going to tell them. So having AI be able to help tutor students in specific ways, not just open-endedly, but specific ways, or have students be able to get feedback on their drafts, or have AI help them with their brainstorming. We can literally help students who might have otherwise dropped out of our classes to finish our classes. And I know some people might say, oh, that's really lofty. But think about how many students we have every semester who can't get past the brainstorming phase, don't turn in a draft, get an F on that paper, and then maybe they get a C in the class, or maybe they just stop coming. And if we can use AI just to bridge that, why wouldn't we?
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to push back a little bit.
Okay, push back.
So what about professors who are saying, okay, you're talking about using it as a collaborator, maybe a collaborator to write a college essay, to get that feedback. How do we, create boundaries on this? How do we kind of like limit it to what you're saying? And do we limit it?
Yes. Yes, we do limit it, but we also tell our students why. And if you're able to link in the show notes to my website, ldumin157.com, I've got some Creative Commons files there that have assignment sheets with AI guidelines on them. And what I have found is that my students, for the most part, are doing what I'm asking them to do, and they're not doing what I'm asking them not to do. So they're not using AI in ways that I don't want them to, because I explain the why. So for example, I've asked them not to use some specific editing softwares because I don't want them to lose their voice. I want to hear their voice, their words, the beautiful ways they say things. And students get excited when they think a professor wants to hear what they have to say and is interested in what they have to say. And we talk about how, yes, grammar and syntax are important, but their stories are the most important thing. So let's get those stories down on paper and talk about them. And by giving students actual guidelines and saying, yes, you can use it here, but we're going to reflect on it at the end. You have to be transparent about where you used it. Or, no, I don't want you to use it here because this is supposed to be your observation of what happened, not an AI's observation. I'm finding that students are, for the most part, doing a really good job of following those guidelines.
Okay.
But if we don't talk to our students about it, students are going to do what students are going to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I'll definitely link that, because I think what we're looking for is specific examples. I know that at this point, when you sit down to plan, you need specific examples of assignments of how you can do this, because we can philosophize all day about how, we need to shift our teaching, which we do, but how do we do that? So thank you. That's going to be helpful.
Yeah, and I will also add really quickly that I think that setting up an environment for our students where we are transparent about our own AI use, talk to them about where it was helpful and where it failed us, helps them to see where it may or may not work for them. And it's also an individual decision to an extent. Some students are really going to find it helpful. Some students are going to think it makes their work worse. And I think it's the same for faculty as well. So taking away that shame in the same way that we would, if somebody has a difference in how they process information, we wouldn't shame them for that processing.
Right.
Same thing with AI use.
There was a conversation recently on the Facebook page about, I think it was about a TA that had used AI to grade student papers. And the point that came up that really stuck with me is an educator presenting to students, because I think there were different solutions that people, kind of brought up and offered to the person who posted. But just the idea of telling students, well, how would you feel if you were graded by an AI? And bringing that in terms of, transparency is like, that seems to, I've talked to my students about that before, and they're horrified, right? They would be horrified if they knew that everything was not going to be seen by me.
Right.
And so maybe presenting it to them that way and telling them, well, hey, I know you have 5 classes and I know it's a lot, but I have, 5 classes too, or I have, this many students, and the pressure, the pressure gets to everybody. So, we're all feeling that pressure to produce, the productivity problem. But how do we, how can I hear your authentic voice, but also teach, use the tools that you're going to need to know how to use in the future anyway?
Yeah. And I think a number of us, we fall in very different camps on that particular issue. And I think we saw that in the responses to that particular post. But I think the answers that stood out to me the most in that were to make it a teaching moment with the TA and not make it a point of, we're going to fire you, or this was horrible. Again, like moving away from the shame and going back to how would you feel if you knew that everything that you were getting back was from an AI? And, just like with our kids, sometimes that's going to backfire because they're going to say, well, I don't care. I mean, that makes your life easier.
That's true.
But what I have also talked to my students about that particular question, and most of them also have said, if AI is going to grade it, then I'm just going to have AI write it. I have no stake in writing something that nobody is going to read or look at or actually assess.
Right. Yeah.
So I think we have to have those conversations with our students and then make decisions where to put AI into our classrooms or not, based on what our students want and need.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, there's some interesting discussions on there that are very thought-provoking. So I'm going to kind of combine these next 2 questions. I'm curious about the embodied learning certification that you got and what that is, but I wonder how we can kind of ensure that the human element, the emotional, social needs of our students are being met. Like with, even with AI, even with more and more technology, it kind of feels like those two things are opposites. So, what is embodied learning? Maybe you can tell us about that. And then also, with more and more technology, how do we serve the needs of our students, their emotional and social lives?
Yeah, I think for me, the big thing is that I'm trying to create connections with my students. Let me also stop and say that I'm privileged in that my class sizes are no larger than 24.
Hmm.
And I'm teaching between 3 and 4 classes a semester. It just depends on what's going on. So I realize that there is privilege in having smaller class sizes and fewer courses that I'm teaching. But I do try to create those relationships with my students. I talk with them very openly about AI. We talk in my comp classes. I actually do something where we start most days of the semester with extra credit, which is tell me about what's going on in the news. And that gives us a chance sometimes to talk about some of the hard topics that we might not otherwise have a chance to talk about. And it usually takes, 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how interesting the news was.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we have to watch a dancing cat afterwards because it was really heavy.
Yeah.
But, we get to talk about how do we deal with mental health in this country, or what are some of the things that you all are seeing that your professors are talking about in this category or that category, or where do you feel that you're being supported or not being supported? And I hope for the most part that my students do know that I actually care about them as human beings and not just as numbers in front of me. I like to give students space also to make mistakes without a failure being detrimental, right? Like a failure can be a learning experience. It does not have to be a wrecking ball to your GPA. And I think that's especially important when we are dealing with students right now who may feel very unattached to other people in their classes. We're still having these COVID kids coming through our first year comp classes.
Yeah.
These are the students who maybe didn't get that research paper, or they didn't get some of the skills that they should have gotten because they were stuck in that AB schedule or that online schedule during COVID. And I think the more that we can create those human connections, the more likely students are to A, enjoy our classes, and B, want to work on what we're asking them to work on because they know we care. And, people will ask me, well, how do I do what you do? And I say, well, number one, you have to be me. But number two, these are some of the things that you can try. But I really think the more that we treat our students like humans, they're young adults, they're still learning, they're going to do things that we go, why did you do that? That was a really poor choice. But they're also trying to figure themselves out. And if we don't show some concern for them, then they're just going to turn to the AI. They're going to turn to the Snapchat AI instead of friends to figure out their problems. And they're going to turn to AI to do their homework and whatever else. And I think there's a lot of space still for that human connection, that, hey, I care about you. Yes, you can come and talk to me. I know that things really stink right now. One of the things I've started saying to my students is you're never so far behind that we can't figure out a plan to get you finished for this semester.
Yeah.
Because also, we're just finishing up week 3. We're about to get to that point where students start dropping off, where all of a sudden their first test is happening or their first major paper is due. And that's when we see that big drop off where students get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And then may make poor decisions with AI use.
Yeah. You made an interesting point though, making that space for that connection. Arguably, technology could do that for us, right? To give us more space for the social and the emotional piece of it that is so important for teaching. But I wonder about, there are critics who say that that using this in the classroom or implementing it, requiring it, whatever, for assignments could widen the digital divide, right?
Right.
And I know, we talked earlier about how you only use the free models, which I think is a great practice. But what do you say to critics who say, well, this is just going to get worse, if they're relying on technology to write their papers, write their code, whatever it might be?
Yeah. I think there's valid concern there.
Yeah.
And I think how we use AI in our classrooms really depends on what we're teaching, number one. So for me, because I'm in a comp classroom, I have a lot of latitude for what I can do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm in a computer lab as well. So I can sit there with my students and I can say, let's try these things out
That's
in
nice.
the classroom, right? So again, there is a privilege in that space, and that I can really help my students to find a way forward that works for them. And that way, students aren't getting left behind, because, you know, what do we see? We see students coming from high school and all they know how to use is Google Docs, and we're not a Google campus, we're a Word campus.
Mm-hmm.
And students get here and they don't know how to save a Word document. They don't know how to open a Word document.
Right.
So yes, I think if we don't have access to those computer labs, if we don't take the time to show our students, you know, maybe we make videos and we post them online, and they should be short,
Mm-hmm.
but showing our students exactly where to click, exactly how to make these things happen, or giving them lists of programs to try and putting them in touch with something like Amanda Bickerstaff's AI in Education group has a prompt library. It's quite
Mm-hmm.
big. And maybe we put students in touch with that and we say, okay, hey, here's a prompt library that you can look at. Yes, these are geared towards educators, but you can start to see what the prompts are supposed to do,
Mm-hmm.
so that you learn how to make good prompting.
Mm-hmm.
I think we also have to make space for the students who either aren't going to use these tools because they feel very strongly against them, or don't have space. So maybe they don't have Wi-Fi at home. Maybe they don't have a computer at home.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of rural areas around us here. I'm just outside of Oklahoma City, and there's a lot of rural area around us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when COVID first hit, we had students sitting in the McDonald's parking lot doing homework.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was the best they had. So yeah, I think that there is definitely an opportunity for the gap to widen if instructors aren't being intentional in how they are asking students to use AI, suggesting that students use it, or taking that time to really show students what they mean,
Mm-hmm.
which is good teaching practice anyway. And I think sometimes we assume that students are going to come to us with all the knowledge about these technologies, and we just have to teach them our content. And we're finding that that is not the case.
You're right. Yeah, I think I noticed a colleague of mine the other day, she took her ENC 1101 class to the library, and I was like, you know, I haven't done that in many semesters. You know, I stopped doing that because there was just so many tools, digital tools in our library, that I felt like I can show you everything here. But yeah, I think taking them, especially because like we don't have, you know, we do have some computer labs. I don't usually teach in computer labs, but just taking them to the computer lab, which for us is, we have our LLC. It's our library and learning lab. So it's together. So yeah, just maybe going for a little field trip and showing them, you know, kind of engaging in that social emotional world, that embodied world. Like, here we are, and here's the librarian. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful practice.
Yeah, I would also say to that the flipped classroom can actually be really helpful for us. So having students watch videos or read things outside of class, but then coming back in and doing their discussions in class,
Mm-hmm.
and working in teams is really helpful as well. So if you've got students who have stronger technology skills and students who have weaker technology skills, you can pair them together and they can work together and learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And taking time in class to share, oh, what tool did you use? Or what thing did you try with AI that just really failed for you this week? Things as small as that again, just take a few minutes in class, can help to decrease that digital divide, because students are hearing about it. Mm-hmm. And it just gets their wheels going too for other ways that maybe they could try these things out in their whatever time they have to try these things out.
Yeah. So let's get down to kind of some foundational stuff. So right now at our college, we are worried about how AI is just disrupting some of the foundational qualities of the way we teach classes. So I'm wondering what you think about rethinking, redeveloping altogether learning outcomes in certain fields. Because for us, that's a big thing. You know, like that's kind of how, when I redesign a class like I'm doing right now, I go back, first thing, I look at the learning outcomes, got to make sure I'm in line with that. should we make any steps to change learning outcomes so that these classes are more worthwhile for this huge investment that students are making? That seems like in some fields that might be a start.
I think there's definitely space for that. I think, I don't know how it works other places, but I know some institutions, the only time the learning outcomes ever come out is when you build the course and get it passed through the curriculum committee, and then nobody ever looks at them again. They go into a filing cabinet.
Right.
And so we also see scope creep as our classes shift and change.
Yeah.
We know that we're updating our courses anyway every few years or maybe every semester as things shift. I mean, we're not still teaching biology classes without a microscope, right?
Right. Yeah.
I hope we're not. That would be bad. So we know that we have to update things anyway. And I think it is valuable if institutions are able to put together committees that go out and talk to people in the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
So what do our students honestly need to know when they get out of our institutions?
Right.
Okay, let's figure out how do we need to revamp our courses. Now, I'm going to caveat that because in some cases, maybe we don't, because like with the humanities, sometimes the arts and humanities are there literally for themselves, right? We are teaching students to appreciate music. We are teaching students to enjoy literature. We are teaching students about medieval history just because it's interesting, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, within English classes, we can say, okay, yes, we want them to learn literature, but we also want them to learn these communication skills or these writing skills that they're going to use in the workplace when they're talking with clients, when they're writing emails, when they're writing reports. And we can look at how AI might help those. And so then possibly shift our learning outcomes. Because I know I'm hearing from people across campus, I barely have enough time in the 15 weeks that we have. What do you mean I have to add AI into this too?
Yes. Yeah. And I mentioned this question only not because I'm trying to create extra work for our faculty, but I think, when we talk about students from all different backgrounds, for some people, this is, even if they get financial aid, this is a huge investment of their life, of their energy. And for it to be worthwhile, I think it's so important to think about. I know some of the communication skills that I teach, I try to really make sure, if I'm getting terrible emails that make no sense and are, I try to go back and say, okay, at the very least, let's make sure we can write each other an email because, that is something that I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon, that you need to be able to write a proper email, in a certain way, in a certain format.
And I think
so I think having those practical skills are important.
Yeah, I think that's a space where AI can help. One of my colleagues, when I was talking to her earlier, was talking about the emotional labor that sometimes comes from being an instructor. When a student says, my parent just died, my dog died, my child is sick. And sometimes you want to go, that's great, but you still missed everything, right? And we can't be cold like that because our students are going to not want to communicate with us then. So that's one of the places where AI can help us as well. Yeah. And then teaching students those communication skills, saying, listen, if you don't know how to write an email, write what you're going to say, take it over into a large language model and ask it to make it more formal or ask it if it understands what you're saying. Yeah. And so we can also lower that gap in communication skills by asking students to do that kind of work as well. And that's not cheating. That's helping students learn how to communicate appropriately for certain situations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it kind of, you can kind of explore self-knowledge. Like if you know yourself to, maybe be a little curt, maybe you're not as empathetic as you'd like to be. Maybe ask, if you're writing a letter or an email, that's going to a place that you really, you want it to hit in a certain way. Yeah, to be able to ask, what does this sound like on your end? I think when it comes to when we were at the at the conference in Orlando, I went to a session that was really fascinating about job interviews. So it was, using AI to help build your resume, but also mock interviews. And so to set ChatGPT Chat GPT up in a way, I think that's the one they were using, to ask me one question and then give me feedback as you would if you were, if you're a hiring manager, at a tech firm.
Yeah, that also can lower that gap, right? Because we've got students who come from backgrounds where, okay, so let me back up for a second. I remember reading a piece a long time ago in one of the poverty classes I taught where the hiring managers were debriefing afterwards and they said, "Oh, can you believe she didn't wear a silk shirt under her suit jacket? She wore a t-shirt. Everybody knows you're not supposed to do that. Like, we're not going to hire her because she doesn't know what to wear."
Right.
And I think having AI be able to sit down and say, okay, that answer doesn't quite do what we want it to do, or you've gone on too long, or we need more detail, that can, again, lessen that gap from students who don't have the opportunity to go to coaching classes or who haven't had a family and cultural background where they've had the opportunity to have interviews like that before.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes me think back to when people used to wear pantyhose. Like, I feel like when I just got into the professional world and being shamed for not wearing pantyhose. And like now, do people wear pantyhose? I don't know.
I've heard in some places in other countries you have to, but no, not in the US. We are not pantyhose people.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about just the evolving role of professors, educators, education itself. I wonder what you think. I talked to Jason a little bit about personalized learning and kind of the rise of this AI mentor, which is a wonderful, opportunity that we have in education. But what happens to us, right? Do you have any ideas about that? What's our role now or in the future when AI can do some of these things?
I think our role is to stay the human. And if AI gets really good at doing something, that's great. Awesome. Love that for it. It does mean, though, that we have to shift. And I think there is, and again, there's privilege in being able to shift. There is privilege in only teaching a 4-4 load at one institution and not being contingent faculty or an adjunct at multiple universities. So I think as we think about how to remain the human, we also have to help students understand what matters to them. So if they've used AI to build all of their engineering projects the whole way through their engineering program, and then they get out into the real world and they're measuring things in real time without an AI program available to them, are they going to know how to do it? Are they going to know if the AI shows them an incorrect schematic for a bridge? Or if you're in a nursing program and you've never taken vitals before because you've always just put all that into the AI and the machines took care of it. What if you have to take vitals? Are you going to have that ability to work with the patient in that moment without that AI there? So I think also reminding students of their own humanity. Yeah. How do we connect with each other? What is important? Why are you here spending $25,000 a year?
Right.
Are you here to have an AI do all your work for you? If so, there are probably cheaper ways to get that information.
Yeah.
So I see that. I see right now a lot of us are doing mental health work, unfortunately, because we have students, again, who they're struggling really hard. And I don't know what it has been. I don't know if it's COVID or what, but over the last 5 years or so, we've seen so many more students coming in feeling unprepared for college, not knowing how to do things like budget time, budget money, figure out how to get to their classes on time, make their dinner. We're seeing more students with food insecurity and housing insecurity. So the humanity comes into all of those spaces because the AI is not going to make you dinner. The AI, we can build bots that will tell you how to find food services or housing services, but we can't follow up with that bot necessarily. Like, we can nudge with the bot, but looking another human in the eye and saying, no, I didn't do it and I'm still really hungry, or yeah, I know I need to get over to student disability services, and then we can say, okay, maybe you and I can walk over together after class. Do you have time? Right?
Yeah.
So those human connections, I think matter just as much, because those soft skills then matter when they get out into the workforce.
Yeah.
And I think that's an equity issue, is teaching soft skills, teaching that it's okay to care about people and that it's okay to bring, I'm going to say, most of our authentic selves to work. Maybe not all of our authentic selves.
Yeah.
But again, AI can't do those things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think it helps, like, with that buy-in, for the students to buy in for why they should not be using AI. I think we can show them, well, if you show up to this job that you're going to get with this degree unprepared, you've never really done it without an AI, then, like, so we're on the same team, right? Like, we're trying to do the same thing. It's only 4 years away, 3 years away, 2 years away. And like, we're on the same page here.
Right.
I think that's a really good point.
I also think that students may assume that these technologies are always going to be available to them. But if we do see more programs switch to a paid model and an expensive paid model, small businesses aren't necessarily going to be able to afford that.
Right.
And, I'm just, for some reason, Doctors Without Borders keeps coming out to me. And like the idea of being sent to a war zone to have to do surgery on people or just triage people and not having computer access in that moment. Like, you have to have that knowledge. So yeah, I think just reminding students of who they are, why they're there, and what matters to them.
Yeah. Yeah. And what happens if your Wi-Fi goes out? I mean, all of this is based on Wi-Fi, on having internet access anyway. So yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of situations just in hospital settings where time is of the essence. You can't even look down at your computer.
Right. Or, we had the airplane outage that actually happened right when we were having the conference.
Yes.
And so a lot of people missed the conference because the computers were down and the airlines couldn't work.
Yeah, that was the craziest thing. Yeah. So to have a security guard walk you to your hotel room because they couldn't make, they just couldn't make room keys. That was crazy. Yeah, but those kinds of things make us realize, we need to be able to problem solve without technology as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about potential biases in AI. So, how do we address those, and so that we can ensure that we don't perpetuate, existing inequities?
Yeah. Number one, I think talking to students about bias is important. And bias in and of itself isn't necessarily bad. I don't like mushrooms. I have a bias against mushrooms, if you will. So I don't eat them. That's fine. But I don't have to like hate the mushrooms, right? And the mushrooms don't have to make me feel bad about myself. Like, I'm not going to eat them. I think sometimes people think that bias is always negative. And also that it's maybe shameful. So again, removing that shame cycle from the bias and saying, okay, yes, these programs, many of them were developed in a Western culture. So they're going to predominantly focus on Western ideals, Western ways of thinking about the world. Let's look at this output and then critique it. And I think very specifically about Gemini and the non-historically accurate Nazis. Right. None of the pictures were white men, which is a huge problem.
Right.
And I think about how a college student would probably realize there was a problem there. A high school student hopefully would probably realize that there's a problem there. My 9-year-old is not going to know that there's a problem there.
Right.
So I think how we talk about biases also depends on the age group that we're working with. But if we're working with higher ed, saying to students, hey, did you notice that every single person in this picture was wearing this particular outfit that would be stereotypical to that country, not normal or normative to that country? Did you notice that the word choices here assume XYZ culture and not these other cultures? So I think we can talk to students about that. We can say, hey, what do you feel is missing from this discussion? Or were there things that you noticed that you wish they would have talked more about that they didn't? Or are there things that did not jive with your cultural experiences? So we don't have to make it a bad thing. We do want students to think about the output and not just take it at face value. We want students to then maybe go out and do Google searches on information and not take the history that's being supplied as accurate either. Because, we know with history textbooks that they have specific focuses and specific lenses that they look through, and they don't tell us everything all the time, right? So I think we have to acknowledge it, and we have to talk about it and talk to our students about going out to other sources. So not just looking at the popular culture sources. What are some other sources that we might look at that might come from historically marginalized communities, or that might come from maybe like underground type news sources that are still valid, of course. And I think that sort of thing is valuable, but just reminding students every time, like, oh, that's a really weird way of saying that. I also think about Whitney Gage Harrison and some of the work that she has done with neurodiverse students being flagged for AI use when they didn't actually use AI. So there's a bias in how we approach the writing that comes out of people, and we say, oh, this sounds like it's AI written, therefore it must be AI written, right? And I think that we have to address our own biases and what we expect to hear. Sometimes we're going to look at a student and we're going to say, I don't feel like that student looks like they should have produced this kind of work.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. So then putting our biases in a drawer and saying, okay, but does this mesh with the other writing that they've turned in? Does this mesh with the conversations that they've been having in class? So maybe they don't, quote unquote, look like they should have produced that kind of work, but they actually are producing that kind of work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. My daughter, she's a college student, and she noted how, there's certain terms that you can tell, that ChatGPT wrote this paper, and she said, but I use the word delve all the time because she goes, I feel like I'm being, that I'm being punished for being well educated. She was like, I learned that in middle school. I love that word. And I'm like, well, you might want to take it out.
Yeah, I have scrubbed delve and foster from my writing completely at this point because I don't want to be accused of using AI where I didn't. And then in the cases where I did, if it's not a big deal that I use the AI, let's not put flags in place that other people might, like, their biases would pop up and say, oh, you used AI because you used those words. And then none of your information is valid because you used AI to help you with your introduction, right? I think our own biases get in the way too.
Yeah. That's true. Is there anything that you are hopeful about? Or maybe you want to repeat, one of the things you've already mentioned about an AI-enabled future for education, specifically with accessibility and equity?
I think, so one of the things that I love now is how easy it is to create correct transcripts for videos.
Yes.
So before, I would take my video, I'd record it, I'd take it over to YouTube. YouTube would make the captions and the transcript, and none of the capitalization would be there. None of the punctuation would be there. It would just be strings of words.
Yes.
And now I can take that transcript back over to Claude, ask it to put in the capitalization and the punctuation, and it does a really good job. And so what used to take me 45 minutes to an hour, and I actually used to outsource to somebody else, I'd pay them to go through my transcripts and fix them. I can do with Claude in just a few minutes. And then my captions are right, and students have transcripts if they need them.
Right.
Because I hate watching videos. Like, why? Please don't make me watch a video. I realize I'm recording one right now.
I know what you mean, though. Sometimes, in certain situations, like I just need the words. I need to see the words in front of me. Yeah.
Right. And especially if I'm completing a task, it can be helpful to see it, but I just want the instructions for me. So knowing that I can now meet my students' needs much more quickly if they need that transcript, or, you even think about a student who's trying to put their baby to sleep, but they're trying to watch a class video. They can put on the captions and they can put their baby to sleep, and they can still have the captions going and not interrupt the baby.
Oh, that's a very sweet image. I like that.
And so these things, when we make anything accessible for one group of students, we are helping all of our students.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's so important. And if there are places where AI can help, like, for example, Nectar has an AI bot that you can put into your system. So Nectar will build out a classroom for you, and you can add the Soma AI to it. And you can put all of your assignment sheets and your syllabus in there. And students can go to Soma at 2 a.m. if they are trying to write their paper before your 9 o'clock class. Not that anybody ever does that, but if they would. And if they had questions, they could ask Soma the questions, and Soma could help them. And if we have AI helpers like that in our classrooms, it can be hard for us to try to reword something 3 or 4 times and the student still doesn't understand.
Yeah.
Well, can they go to the AI? The AI is not going to get overwhelmed by them or angry with them or say, look, we just need to keep class moving forward. Talk to me after, right? So that also removes that shame cycle, which can help students be more willing to learn.
Yeah.
Because they don't get any of that negative feedback from the voice or the tone or the confusion.
Yeah.
So I think there are definitely spaces where AI can help students and maybe take down those barriers to functional learning the way that they need to learn.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I think that's a really great way to end this conversation, because how many times have you gotten an email? I know I have, like, I'm so sorry to bother you, from a student I've never heard from, one-on-one, and they're so sorry to bother me. And I'm like, but no, I want you to ask me questions. But so for those students to be able to ask Soma 9 times, to ask it, to be worded, 9 different ways, because we do get tired, but yeah, that's a really great way to use it.
Yeah.
Before we end, I want to ask, what does the future look like for you in terms of AI? Like, are you developing any new programs or ideas, maybe publications?
I do have a couple of chapters that will hopefully be coming out in books over this fall, I think, maybe at the latest spring. One of them is the one that Flower mentioned in her keynote at the conference, is about AI and professors and the grief cycle and Schitt's Creek.
I was going to ask you about that. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yes. I think I'm going to get the Mattel dolls of Schitt's Creek to go along with it when I have that chapter published.
Yes. I'm a big fan. So, I don't think I got a chance to talk to you after that, but I was like, oh my gosh, we need to talk about Schitt's Creek.
Yeah. So that one's fun. And
Wonderful.
Then one of them is about using technology well with AI and how to encourage responsible, ethical, and transparent technology use. As far as what I'm doing in my classrooms, interestingly, I don't think it has shifted a lot. I saw everybody jump on the chatbot bandwagon, which is great for people who have testing or have, really content-heavy courses. My courses are learning how to write and talk to each other and make arguments that make sense. And so, yeah, I guess we could have like argumentation chatbots, but I haven't seen value for me in that space yet, right? And I think one of the things for me is that we just continue trying it out. I want students to play. So for me, it's play and experimentation. Try it out. Figure out what does and doesn't work for you. Don't feel like you have to use it or not use it because of some sort of like outward pressure.
Right.
And so for my students, I will continue giving them guidelines. If the programs change, we'll shift with it. It's fine. If they don't change, great, then we're in a good place.
Yeah.
But I think, for me, the future is just trying to keep up with it, making sure that especially my tech writing students are equipped when they walk out of our university to edit or to write and to leverage the AI technologies so that they can do their jobs better. And maybe they can also help their authors to not use AI in places where it's going to make their jobs harder.
Yeah, for sure. Wonderful. So I'm definitely going to be linking your page. I know you said it out loud, but I will link it so that we can follow your work. And thank you so much for joining me today, because you have such a passion for education and equity and accessibility. And I love following your curiosity too. Like you're so curious about these new tools, but you're not, like you said, you're not changing if you don't have to.
Yeah.
You're also agile, you're flexible in your teaching. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Scoot over for just a second and point out all of these coins here.
Oh yeah. What are they?
Those are all micro-credentials that I earned. Most people will take years. I was actually the first one here to finish all of them, and I finished them this past year. But they're all on
Congratulations. Oh my gosh.
They're all on different teaching things. So it's learning, applying, disseminating, and there's, I think, assessing is the other one. But all of these different teaching techniques. So yeah, I spend a lot of time doing pedagogy things.
Wow.
Because
that's really inspirational. Because I've put a note to myself. I want to get some micro credentials these next couple of years.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we can't tell our students to have a learning mindset if we don't have a learning mindset.
Right. You're right.
So, I'm always trying to find whatever book groups I can be in here with our Pedagogy Institute or workshops I can take so that I can keep learning. And not everything is going to resonate and not everything is going to make it into my teaching. But the more that I know about different teaching techniques, the more I can try things out and see what works for me and personalize things better for my specific classrooms.
You're right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Laura. So if you're interested in exploring more about Laura's work and Facebook community, be sure to check out the links in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, and let me know what you're interested in hearing more about. We still have a few slots open. This podcast is released every month for the year, or the academic year 2024-2025. So we're going all the way up through April. I didn't even tell you this. I didn't tell you that Flower is going to be on our next episode.
Oh, very exciting.
Yeah. So join me next time. I'll be speaking to Flower Darby. So we're going to discuss mental health and the human element in a rapidly changing world due in large part to AI in education. So until next time, thanks for joining me at AI Goes to College.